Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can more effectively minister to the body of Christ. Today we have with us Dr. Neil Gilliland. He's been working with IM for several years with member care. He and his wife were house parents for the children's home there in East Tennessee, and he also worked as a house parent for international missions many years ago there in Ivory Coast. So, Neil, you've got a wide range of experience. It's so good to have you here with us today.
Good to be here.
Well, today, though, we've got you here because you've written this new book, A View from Grief's Window, 10 Lessons Learned from the Death of My Parents. And so, Neil, right now, there's a lot of grieving that we're going through more than extra, really.
Right.
You're talking about in the book what you learned from the death of your parents, but this is something that we all need because we're all going to grieve, and in many ways grieving right now, don't we?
Sure. It's interesting that I would write a book on grief because most of the time I'm viewed, I think, as the court jester.
Yes.
And so for me to write something about grief seems like almost like an oxymoron. But let me just tell you how that came about.
Yes.
That might be helpful, interesting. As a counselor, one of the things I always recommend to people is to write out what you're experiencing. I don't know how you did it as a counselor, but very often I just think it's very helpful to write what you're experiencing. So in 2003, just before our national convention, my dad fell and broke his hip. He was almost 94 years old. And so just as the convention was ending, I got a call, said you need to get home quick. Your dad's probably not going to make it. So through that event, I just started writing. Just my own, certainly not for a book, but just started writing what I was experiencing. Well, I just kept writing down through the years, and then 10 years later, my mom passed away, and so I just kept writing. A friend of mine that was on Truth and Peace staff, who happens to be an English teacher, was going through some grief, so I would send her things that I'd written. And she said, you really need to make this into a book. And so she just kept encouraging me to do it. So that's kind of how the book came about. I wrote very short for two reasons. One is most people who are going through grief, like we're going through now, don't want to sit down and read a scholarly tome on grief. Yeah. They want to read experientially what happened. So these are just 10 lessons that I learned. To try to normalize what people are going through. It's not necessarily a book about this is how you deal with it or this is what you say to people that are grieving, but to just bring some sense of normalcy to what people who are experiencing. Even now, it may not be a death, but we, like you said, we grieve all the time. And certainly during this pandemic, there's been lots of grief, and maybe it will bring some normalcy. The second reason is most people that I know aren't readers.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, I gave the manuscript to a friend of mine who said, I'm not a reader, but I sat down and read this whole thing in one evening. You can read it probably in one evening. Probably if you're a good reader, read it in an hour. And it's filled with stories. One of the things I've discovered about myself, even reading the Bible, I learn much more from the narrative than I do propositional truth. That is, I learn through stories. And so the book is a bunch of stories.
About that.
About the grieving process.
Well, first off, it's just a good idea to write things out. So you're a counselor, but you still wrote this out.
Yeah.
You're sharing it. So that's also kind of a process. This is kind of what I'm going through. I happen to be an English person, so that helped with the writing aspect. So there's some lessons, folks listening now.
Absolutely. The reason I always tell people to write is it gets it out of your head and onto a piece of paper. So it's not rattling around in your brain. It's on a piece of paper, and then you can go back and edit it if you need to. If I'm going to have a serious conversation with somebody, I'm usually going to write up first. Here are what my thoughts are, and then I go, I don't need to say that, or I don't need to say this. So it's just very cathartic to me, or very helpful to me to take it out of my head and put it on a piece of paper.
So it's healing, processing, thinking it through, and then you can also, as you've done, you can go back and you can see where you were when you first got the news.
Right.
where you were down the road, and then later when your mom passed too.
Yeah, and my experience, my parents lived, Dad was almost 94, Mom was almost 99 when she died. I made a mistake at a church once. When I was talking about my dad, I said he passed away when he was 94. But when you're 94, you're supposed to. Uh-huh. Well, there was a 94-year-old lady in the church who took real exception to that. Yeah. She was mad at me. But not everybody's experience is that way. But the grieving process is the same, even though it may be different. One of the things I point out in the book is not everybody grieves the same way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
For some, it's a very overt emotional thing, and for others, it's a very personal thing. Mm-hmm. Nor is there a time limit to grief.
Yes. Yeah.
I've often heard people say, well, they should be over it by now. No, they shouldn't.
No.
Some people are.
Yeah.
But some people aren't. Some people, it takes for years. I tell a story in the book of a pastor who went to visit a nursing home, and he saw a lady over in the corner crying, and he said, what's wrong? He figured, she's missing her kids or missing her husband. She goes, I miss my daddy. And she's an old lady. So she was still grieving after all that time.
There's an example, Joseph, he's grieving in chapter 50 of what happened decades earlier. So that's where you're getting at. This is a natural thing.
It's a natural thing, and it's okay.
It's okay. It's a biblical thing. And even, there's some people that are like, well, you mentioned my dad was 90. You have to be careful about that.
But, you do.
But
learned that the hard way.
Right. But there is someone probably thinking, well, my dad died when he was 30 or 40 or whatever.
Right.
And the point is, no matter what, it's a loss. It's a death.
It's a loss.
And
every loss is a loss. And, even if you lose your keys, there is this moment of grieving that what once was is not anymore.
So our culture wants to put a time limit. Okay, we've had the funeral. We've took the meal, the casserole over. It's done. Move on. And really, what you're trying to say is, no, this is a natural thing, and this is a needed thing.
Yes. Some people try to avoid grief, I think.
Yeah.
And I say, don't avoid it. Go ahead and grieve. However you need to do that. It's okay.
It's okay. So, folks, pick up a copy of A View from Grief's Window. Number one, it's going to be a short read. So it'd be a good idea.
An easy read.
A good read, an easy read, lots of good stories in there.
Biblical stories as well as personal stories.
Okay, so they'll pick that up. Could also be something maybe folks could use as a Bible study, I suppose.
Oh, absolutely. I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you're looking for something to do. You're thinking, hey, even if we're locked down during COVID-19, hey, why don't you read a chapter? We could talk about it via Zoom or whatever. And somebody could read it. It's not a step-by-step process of how to go through grief, but it just helps to normalize it.
As we study psychology, we talk about Kubler-Ross's model, but it was just a model.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's not, this is the way everybody grieves. I never went through an anger stage.
Right.
I never went through a bargaining stage with my parents. I came to an acceptance stage that, okay,
this is
life. Death is part of life. Which seems almost like an oxymoron too, but it is. It's a part of all of our life. I always say, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, but he's not here now. Mm-hmm. At some point,
he died.
And so it is a natural process, and we don't like to make it. But sometimes it feels. I talk about this in the book as well. Incongruent, and what I mean by that is. Sometimes we're happy that they have passed away because they're not in pain anymore.
Yeah.
And yet there's something missing now. And we feel like we have to choose.
Yeah.
One of those. I say, no, you don't.
No, it can be both.
Yeah, it can be both. I can be happy that they're gone, but there may be a day I have to pull the car off the side of the road and cry. It wasn't. In the past 2 weeks, I woke up in the middle of the night and started crying because I missed my dad.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Right. Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with it. It's and again, it's the whole point of the book. It's normal. It's normal to grieve in the way that you have to grieve.
And so you're trying to get that across to folks. It's scriptural. We see Jesus grieving. You
Absolutely.
Lazarus he knows he's about to raise him from the grave, and he's grieving, he's crying. And it'll help people to get an idea of that. You know, people always ask these questions. Do you have a favorite of these lessons that you?
Do I have a favorite? Probably the one that I just talked about, that incongruence of that we feel like if we're happy, then we didn't honor them.
Right.
But if we're sad all the time, then that doesn't seem
good
right.
either.
And so I just think you don't have to choose.
It's going to be
Both
messy.
of those, depending what day it is. And there's going to be something that will trigger this moment that all of a sudden now I just have to cry.
And that's okay.
It's totally okay. Or I don't have to cry. I can be happy. So, yeah, that's probably if I have a favorite part.
That would be it. And so also for you, a big way of coping was the writing part out. What else kind of helped you cope?
And it's really my family who will read this book. Hopefully they'll read this book. They will know we've told these stories 1,000 times. We tell the stories over and over. I think one of the best things you can do with anybody who is grieving, tell the stories.
Oh, yes. Tell
the stories because, one, it keeps them alive. The stories keep us all. And so write down the stories. I didn't want to forget the stories.
Yeah.
So I wrote them down.
Yeah.
And it just happened to put it all together and made a book. Not all the stories, but there are some of those stories.
Yeah.
It is so important to tell the stories.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. So like often like someone loses a child and that's I don't want him forgotten.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is tell the stories, write the stories, and it's a way of
preserving that and honoring them. Yes.
And so sometimes people do that on the anniversary of the death or a celebration or whatever.
Right.
But such a key thing.
It is.
Well, anything else we need to know as we're?
I just think I also think it would be a great resource for churches to give to people who are grieving. You know, you want something here. Here's an easy way. Matter of fact, my friend, whether I was supposed to do this or not, he asked if I could give the manuscript to somebody who had just lost somebody. I said, that's why I wrote.
Right.
He said they read it, gave me the manuscript back, and said, I want 5 copies of this as soon as it comes out. Because it was helpful.
Yeah.
And that was the whole point of writing the book, of I want to be a practical help to people who are going through grief.
That's great. So we encourage our folks, get a copy. You can go to randallhouse.com. It'll also be available at amazon.com and wherever good books are sold. Not where the bad books are, but the good books. And it's something good, really, that all of us should read because it helps to normalize grief. It helps. We're all going to grieve at one point or another. And so it's good for all of us to be aware of, and especially, someone that's lost someone recently or struggling a little bit.
Sure.
It just helps to read it and normalize it.
And even, like you said, not just in losing people, it's losing life the way we once knew it.
Yes.
Or church the way we knew it.
The graduations, the wedding wasn't the way it was supposed to be.
Yeah. And you grieve that.
Yeah. And we'll go through that. We're going to go through that for a while now. So this is good timing, you could say.
It is. I think so.
Well, we thank you for taking the time to write these things out, to share them with the person that was good at English, and then to follow through, because it is kind of.
And I let Clint read it, and he corrected he did a lot of editing for me.
Well, you've got to take that with a grain of salt.
Well, that's true.
Of course, we'll cut this part out of the podcast, but it's good to know Clint is, and he's been through it too recently. So it's a good thing to for all of us to think about.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Neil. We appreciate you. We appreciate the work you do, and we appreciate you taking the time for writing this book too.
Thank you.